TWAGAA presents the podcast on the book, The Ocean Within Me, written by Anil Deswal.
Imagine being locked inside a colossal steel vault, just surrounded by this deafening, bone-rattling roar of a massive diesel engine for, months on end.
Sounds pretty awful, honestly.
Right. Your whole world is just this sensory assault. It's oil, grease, these high-pressure valves, and then just the endless, indifferent gray of the open ocean right outside.
Yeah, definitely not the kind of place you'd think of as an artist's retreat.
Exactly. You wouldn't expect that environment to produce, like, delicate, handwritten poetry. Stuff about the light of the full moon or the quiet dignity of a stray dog.
Or the profound stillness of the human soul.
Yeah. But today, for this deep dive, we are looking at a stack of sources that proves that assumption completely wrong.
Entirely wrong, yeah.
We're diving into excerpts from a 2026 poetry collection called The Ocean Within Me. And it's written by a man named Anil Deswal, who publishes under the pen name Dash.
Right.
Publisher bringing this really unusual work to the public.
And the setting here is really the core tension of this entire collection because, historically we have this heavily romanticized image of the poet.
Oh, for sure. Sitting in a sunlit cafe somewhere.
Right, or cloistered in some quiet academic library. But Anil Deswal, he's a Marine Chief Engineer from Rohtak, Haryana. His daily reality is just completely grounded in heavy industrial machinery.
And we need to look at what that actually means because, honestly, a quick glance at his resume is kind of intimidating.
Oh, absolutely.
He doesn't just work on ships. He's an external surveyor with the Mercantile Marine Department of India. He's a lead auditor with Class D&V.
Which is huge.
Yeah, a superintendent.
Yeah.
And he's the president of the Merchant Navy Officers Welfare Association of the NCR. That's the National Capital Region in India. And, for anyone outside the maritime industry, those aren't just fancy titles.
No, they carry massive responsibility.
Right. Class D&V is one of the world's largest classification societies. Being a lead auditor for them means you are the person scrutinizing these massive vessels, making sure they comply with intense international safety regulations.
Environmental regulations, too.
Yeah. It's a job where literally a single overlooked detail could mean a catastrophic failure at sea.
Which requires an incredibly rigid, analytical mindset. I mean, you are managing millions of dollars of cargo. You're navigating international logistics, and you're literally keeping the crew alive in an environment that actively wants to sink you. It's just a world of pure, unforgiving pragmatism.
Okay, let's unpack this, though.
Yeah.
Because running parallel to that heavy, pragmatic responsibility, the sources show us this totally different side of him.
The NGO, right.
Exactly. He runs an NGO called Haryana. And Haryana isn't focused on maritime logistics. It's dedicated to helping seafarers, supporting local animals, and just providing resources to anyone in need.
Which is such a fascinating split.
It really is. It's like finding this delicate, blooming flower growing right in the middle of a massive, greasy diesel engine. You just don't expect a guy whose job is checking pressure valves to be the one pondering the cosmos.
Well, what's fascinating here is that split tells you a lot about the psychological pressure valve he's created for himself. And it really explains how the pen name Dash came to be in the first place.
Right, because he started writing during the pandemic, didn't he?
Yeah, the texts tell us his previous book, Queen Corona Coronation, was essentially a memoir of that era. Because when the global lockdowns hit, the whole maritime supply chain just seized up.
Ships were totally stalled.
Stalled out. The sea went entirely quiet. He was stuck out there, completely isolated, and he noted that picking up a pencil and writing was what kept his mind tethered to reality.
And the physical act of using a pencil is such an important detail to me. He's not, typing out notes on a sterile smartphone screen.
Right. He's doing handwritten drafts on worn paper pads.
Yeah, he embraces the smudges, the physical act of erasing, the tactile reality of the graphite on paper. And he describes his process as being very patient.
Very organic.
Yeah, like if the words aren't coming, he simply backs off. He treats inspiration the exact same way a sailor treats the wind. You can't force it, you just have to be prepared when the weather finally turns.
And we have to consider where he's actually sitting when that inspiration arrives. A lot of the 100 poems in this collection were written on loose sheets of paper during what mariners call dog watches.
Okay, dog watches.
Yeah.
Those are the quiet evening shifts, right?
Yeah.
When the rest of the crew is asleep.
Well, it's actually a bit more psychologically taxing than just a normal quiet shift. A dog watch in maritime scheduling is specifically a fractured shift.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Usually, a ship's watch schedule is divided into 4-hour blocks, but a dog watch splits a single block, typically between 1,600 and 2,000 hours, so 4 p.m. to 8 p.m. to two shorter 2-hour shifts.
Why would they do that? That sounds annoying.
The entire purpose is to rotate the schedule so that the same crew members aren't stuck working the exact same hours every single day.
Oh, so it's actively disrupting their circadian rhythms.
Precisely. You are constantly in a state of rolling sleep deprivation.
Wow.
Your brain is in this liminal twilight state where you're physically exhausted, but you still have to remain hypervigilant because, you're monitoring dangerous machinery.
Right.
And when the human brain is pushed into that space-fatigued but alert, isolated but surrounded by the rhythmic thrum of a two-stroke diesel engine, it often slips into a meditative state.
That's wild.
Yeah, the mechanical repetition of the engine actually provides a framework for poetic meter.
So what does this all mean when we look at the poetry? Because that makes perfect sense when you read the poem on the ship. He completely blurs the boundary between human biology and industrial mechanics.
He really does.
He writes that when the massive ship lunges forward in the water, it feels like his own life lunging ahead. And when the engine fires up down in the hull, he says, it's my heart beating loud in the control room.
He's fully integrated into it.
Exactly. He isn't just observing the machine. His nervous system has practically synced up with it.
Because after months at sea, that boundary does disappear. And, it's not always a triumphant feeling.
Right, like in Rust and Dust.
Yeah, look at Rust and Dust. He lays out the shared life cycle of the sailor and the vessel. Ships are built, they sail the oceans relentlessly, and eventually the saltwater and time break them down until they rust away.
And men do the exact same thing.
Exactly. They work, they sail, they age, and they turn to dust. They are both consumed by the friction of the journey.
But there's also this fierce pride in that consumption, I think. Like in the poem Marine Engineers, he strikes this really defiant tone.
Oh, very defiant.
He talks about how they actually thrive on the sea highs, and they actively enjoy getting their hands dirty changing out filters. He says explicitly that they are not meant for offices with glass partitions and desktops.
Right, they are sea riders.
Yeah, it's a total rejection of the sterile corporate world.
It is a rejection of it, but it also forces a question about the psychological toll of all that isolation.
And that brings up a specific line in the text that really lodged in my brain. In that same poem, On the Ship, he describes a sailor as a man trapped in endless time.
That's a heavy line.
It is. When I read that, it immediately made me think of a sensory deprivation tank.
Oh, interesting. How so?
Well, we know that if you put a human being in a lightless, soundless tank, the brain gets starved of external stimuli, and it will literally start hallucinating just to entertain itself.
Right, to fill the void.
Yeah. So given that he's staring out at thousands of miles of identical featureless water, is his poetry a form of the brain generating its own reality just to avoid going mad?
See, it's a compelling theory, but I'd actually argue it's less about deprivation and more about an attention funnel.
An attention funnel.
Yeah, because the ocean isn't a silent void. The engine is roaring, the ship is vibrating, but what is stripped away is the social noise.
Ah, okay.
You don't have the constant barrage of advertisements, traffic, small talk, digital notifications. And Anil addresses this directly in his poem Solitude.
Right, I remember that one.
He doesn't view his isolation as a trap or a hallucination. He writes, "It's never lonely when I am with me."
So the isolation acts as a mirror rather than a void.
Exactly. When you strip away the social noise of the land, you are forced to sit with your own thoughts. And for many people, that level of introspection is terrifying.
Totally.
But Anil leans into it. He calls it a fantasy world and an absolute high. He uses the isolation to sharpen his internal focus.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. What happens when that highly sharpened, hyper-focused attention is suddenly pointed back at the land?
Oh, it changes everything.
Right. Because when you've been living in a world of rigid steel and volatile oceans, the mundane elements of terrestrial life, dirt, trees, small animals, they must look incredibly vibrant.
Almost overwhelming.
Yeah. And we see this immediately in the dedications of his book. He doesn't just dedicate it to family, he dedicates it to his pets, Astro and Maya, to the community cats in his neighborhood, and very specifically to Missy, the dog who lives near my home and whom we all love.
The empathy he displays for animals is just fascinating because of how he constructs it mechanically. In the poem That Dog in the Street, he doesn't just describe watching a stray dog.
No, he becomes the dog.
Right, he writes the entire poem from the dog's internal perspective.
The dog is watching this white car speed by every single day. and the animal is deeply confused. It doesn't understand why humans throw stones or shout abuses when its only biological instinct is to wag its tail and seek a pack.
It's heartbreaking.
It is. The dog asks, "What have I done wrong?" As no one ever tells. And it ends with this quiet prayer that the driver of the white car will someday buy a black collar and take him home.
And to write that effectively requires a complex linguistic translation. He's taking the nonverbal biological desperation of a stray animal and decoding it into a human societal framework.
He's giving a voice to the voiceless.
Exactly. To a creature that our society typically treats as invisible, or worse, as a nuisance.
It's just an intense level of observation. I mean, it's like he possesses X-ray vision for empathy. While most of us just rush past in our cars, stressed about a meeting, staring at the road ahead, he stops. He mentally translates a stray dog's barks into an articulate plea for belonging.
And he applies that same mechanism to the environment as a whole.
Right, like in
And came the man.
Yes, in came the man. He tracks the historical destruction of nature. He describes this pre-human era where the river spoke to the air and the fish swam without fear.
And then we show up.
Then humanity arrives with hidden motives, carving up the earth and placing human names above the gods. But notice the contrast he builds there.
Even in a poem about environmental plunder, he spots the resilience. Exactly. He points out a single green leaf fighting its way up through a crack in solid concrete. He frames nature not just as a victim, but as a deeply forgiving entity that is patiently waiting for humanity to correct its behavior.
He plays with that idea of forgiveness again when he looks at human geography, too. In Roads to the Village, he describes old dirt roads that remember the people who walk on them. The land itself is warm. It smiles when you return.
A stark contrast to the city.
Yeah, he sharply contrasts that with the urban environment in a poem called Clocks.
Clocks is a brilliant critique of urban infrastructure. In the village, time is tied to the sun and the seasons. But in the city, time is this rigid mechanical construct, the ticking of clocks.
And it doesn't work for everyone.
No, Anil notes that those clocks no longer work for the homeless invisible men begging on the pavements. The societal machine of the city has completely failed them. He refers to these men as lost souls swinging into the bottomless pits of timelessness. They are entirely outside the city's mechanism.
It takes a staggering amount of empathy to recognize that.
Yeah.
You have a man who spends his entire professional life enforcing the rigid mechanics of heavy industry, yet he can perfectly articulate how those exact same rigid mechanical structures in society completely crush the vulnerable.
Yeah.
Like, how does someone bridge that gap?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, he provides the formula for that in his poem titled Wisdom. He writes that wisdom is not the loudest voice in the room, it is the pause before the answer.
The pause before the answer.
Empathy isn't something you are just naturally born with, and it isn't something you learn from an engineering manual. Empathy requires the conscious decision to pause, to stop moving. Wisdom, as he frames it, is the realization of just how much human experience we miss when we are constantly rushing.
That pause is everything.
Yeah.
So we have this engineer suspended in the middle of the ocean writing these deeply observant, empathetic thoughts during the fractured twilight of a dog watch. But a handwritten poem in an engine room doesn't automatically become a published book. It has to be brought to the mainland. And that brings us to the publisher of this collection, TWAGAA International.
Yes, TWAGAA is a Mumbai-based publishing house, and their acronym is incredibly earnest. It stands for Together We Are Great, Amazing, and Awesome.
Which is quite the pivot from the harsh realities of the mercantile marine industry.
It is, but it aligns with their core operational model. They don't just publish individual novels, they focus heavily on producing anthologies. They are gathering diverse, isolated voices and putting them into shared collections.
Like what kind of collections?
The texts list several of their publications, like The Salt in Our Veins, The Sea Within, and A Class Apart. They are actively pulling mariners, educators, and alumni into collaborative spaces.
That's a cool mission.
And their stated mission goes beyond just selling books. They claim they're helping writers realize their potential as civilization builders.
Okay, wait, I had to push back on that specific phrasing. Civilization builders. Isn't that putting a massive, almost absurd amount of weight on a simple book of poetry?
How do you mean?
Well, civilizations are built on agriculture, right? On supply chains, which Anil literally helps run. They're built on legal frameworks and sanitation. Calling a poetry anthology about stray dogs and the moon civilization building feels like, I don't know, heavy-handed marketing spin.
You think it's too grand.
Yeah. Think of a solitary poem as a message in a bottle thrown into the ocean. TWAGAA is essentially catching millions of these bottles and using them to build an island, ensuring that no one is left stranded alone. But is poetry really building civilization, or is it just a luxury we consume once the civilization is already built?
See, that is the classic utilitarian argument against art, but it ignores how civilizations actually function on a sociological level.
Okay, I'm listening.
A supply chain can move grain from one port to another, sure, and a legal framework can punish theft. But neither of those things can make a society cohere. Historically, long before the printing press, civilizations relied entirely on the oral traditions of wanderers, merchants, and sailors.
Because they traveled.
Exactly. They were the ones traveling between isolated city-states, bringing back stories of how other people lived, suffered, and loved.
So they were the information network.
More than that, they were the empathy network. A society that only has infrastructure but no shared empathy is just a machine. It's prone to fracture and violence. When a sailor like Anil translates the fear of a stray dog or the isolation of a homeless man in the city, he is expanding the reader's capacity to understand and experience completely foreign to their own.
Wow, okay.
Empathy is the mortar that holds the bricks of a civilization together. So no, I completely agree with them. TWAGAA isn't overstating it. By collecting these isolated voices, they are actively building the empathetic infrastructure required for a civilization to survive itself.
That completely changes the context of his work. It isn't just self-expression, it's a structural contribution. And that maps perfectly onto the very first poem in Anil's book, which is titled, "You Are Not Alone."
Yes, a beautiful opening.
He talks about dancing at midnight, chatting with trees, being looked at like he's lost his mind. But the core of the poem is a vow to the reader. He promises that if your soul wanders beyond the safety of the land, if it strays out into the terrifying expanse of the ocean, trust me, you are not all alone.
He is throwing a lifeline out into the dark.
He really is.
And TWAGAA is functioning as the network, catching those lifelines and weaving them into a safety net. It brings to mind a quote from the sources. Anil mentions a former shipmate of his, a man named Tristan, who had a very simple but profound operating philosophy.
What did he say?
Tristan used to say, "What is life without a little care when you have no time to stand and stare?"
No time to stand and stare. That is the ultimate diagnosis of our modern condition, isn't it?
It absolutely is.
We are all so relentlessly busy, optimizing our time, managing our schedule, staring at our screens, that we've lost the ability to simply observe. Which is exactly why a deep dive like this matters.
Yeah.
Because whether you are rushing to a meeting or just trying to navigate a world full of information overload, you need that pause. You don't have to be a marine engineer stationed on a cargo ship in the middle of the Pacific Ocean to implement this. You can find your own version of a dog watch.
Right, a quiet moment.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Whether you are stuck in traffic, waiting in line at the grocery store, or just sitting at your desk before a meeting starts, you can carve out that pause. You can choose to stand and stare.
That is the challenge Anil Deswal leaves us with. We've just spent this time exploring how a man locked inside a deafening, vibrating steel hull, surrounded by grease and heavy machinery, managed to locate an entire universe of profound empathy and delicate poetry.
Against all odds, really.
Yeah, he didn't let his mechanical environment turn him into a machine. So as you transition back into the noise of your own day, consider your environment. What invisible poetry are you ignoring during your own mundane daily commute?
What's waiting to be noticed?
Exactly. What quiet desperation or hidden beauty is right in front of you, just waiting to be written down before the ink of your own day dries?
Hope you enjoyed the podcast and would be keen to read the poems by Anil Deswal. You may order a copy of the book, The Ocean Within Me, directly from the publisher's site, TWAGAA.com, or from Amazon.com. Thank you for listening.